The black color. What can be easier to paint? Just prime the model black, put some gray highlights and call it done. Well, kinda yes. Of course, you can paint your miniature this way and do it quite fast, but the result will probably look just like a dark mess on a tabletop. Hi everyone and welcome to the Exalted Wargamer. My name is Stan and today I'm going to show you my approach to painting the black armor on this Deathwatch Killteam. There are lots of different approaches to black armor. You can make it a new and glossy or old beaten with a matte finish. You can also add different color variations and interesting shadows. But for this project I chose the matte armor with light battle damage and warm highlights. Also keep in mind that it's a commission project, so I will paint it in a timely fashion, cutting some edges. But I'm still aiming for a good tabletop quality, and remember, it's just my approach, so feel free to change it and adapt. But enough preamble, let's get painting. And as always, first we need to prime the models. As our miniatures will be literally black, this time I chose the Vallejo Black Primer. I sprayed it through my Harder & Steenbeck Infinity CR Plus airbrush with 0.4mm needle and nozzle. Of course, you can use black rattle can primer instead. Just make sure to apply it all over the minis in a couple of layers and let them dry in between, as we don't want all these fine little details to be clogged. So anyway, it's quite cold outside now, and that's why I chose the good old airbrush. After our primer is completely dry, let's establish the main color for the black armor. And, surprise surprise, it's not black. Instead, I decided to use a dark grey color. It may sound controversial, but I believe that for tabletop painting, it's way better to use dark grey instead of actual black. Typically, you play in places with relatively bad light conditions, so true black colors will look too dark and boring on the tabletop, but this dark grey color way more interesting. And when we paint all the other bright details, it will look really dark and will read as black. So yeah, here I just sprayed this color in a zenithal-ish manner. I still try to cover the whole miniature, but I try to leave the recesses black, and I'm fine if some lower facing elements also remain black. But enough airbrushing. Let's switch to the hairy brush and finish the armor. I don't want too big of a color jump here, so for the first highlight I mixed the original dark grey with some warm reddish grey, roughly 50-50. This is our first highlight, and we will cover it later with the second one, so I applied it in a quite a sketchy manner. I painted it around all the edges, and for the spherical shapes such as knees and the backpack exhaust, I draw a couple of dots in the upper left part of the sphere. Also, to add more visual interest and break the monotony of huge armor areas such as backpack and leg armor, I drew some battle damage in the form of random dots and strokes. Just don't overdo it too much, or the armor starts to look too bright. And for the second highlight, I switched to the pure reddish grey. This time I'm trying to work more precisely, applying it only on the edges of the armor. But as the armor parts are quite large, it's not too hard. Just use the sides of your brush instead of the tip. Hold it perpendicular to the surface and draw the highlight. Yeah, it requires lots of rotation of the miniature to get the needed angle, but in the end you will get some nice thin highlights. Also, don't forget to add some battle damage if you want. Now our armor is almost done, and it's perfectly fine to leave it as it is. But all in all, it's the biggest part of the Space Marine. So I want to add a bit more readability to our miniature. This time I'm using a lighter warmer grey, putting it only on the upper facing edges. It's really crucial to limit yourself and apply it only on the most important parts that catch the light, such as arms, helm, shoulder pads and a backpack. I also applied it on the rivets and as a small dots on some corners. And while I'm adding some final touches to the armor, don't forget to go through all the YouTube things. Smash that like button, repost and subscribe to the channel. It really motivates me to work harder. And you will get more videos just like this. So now our black armor is done. Next, let's move to the details. And first of all, I decided to paint the rubber armor joints. You can make them black, metal or whatever you want, but I decided to paint them light neutral grey. It will separate the black armor elements quite nicely. and the light to dark contrast will help our armor look even darker. The painting process here is quite straightforward. First, I painted the joints with the darker gray, then highlighted the individual rubber things with a lighter one. These areas are quite small, so don't waste too much time here. And remember, if you made a mistake and slapped some light gray over the armor, you can always fix it. Or just ignore, it's just a bit different gray, wherever. So, at this point we established our main color. Now let's add a bit of a color punch, and what can be punchier than a good old red? But I want my red still to be quite dark, so I started with 50-50 mix of dark red and purplish black. I covered the gun casing, cables and the wax part of the purity seal with this color. Also I drew a vertical stripe on the left knee of our marine. Then I switched to pure dark red and started to highlight these areas. It may require a couple of layers for a solid highlight. At this point I'm trying to establish the main color sketch and separate all the details. So I equally highlight all the edges of the bolter, and of course I drew some battle damage. But on the knee I placed the highlights mostly on the upper left corner of the stripe, and the cable and the purity seal are just too small, so I put the all over highlight that cover about 70% of the initial color. For the final extreme highlight I switched to the carmine red. This time I applied it mostly on the gun, touching only the upper facing edges and drawing some random dots and strokes to simulate battle damage. And that's it. Next, let's paint the leather gear on our Space Marine. Leather brown sounds like a perfect paint for the base coat. So let's paint the holsters, the belt and the rifle sling. It's quite a light color, so you may need several thin layers to cover the black undercoat properly. Now we need to add some depth and shadows to our leather, but using just a mix with black or darker brown will be too boring. So let's add a bit of magic. I mixed a tiny amount of dark blue with the leather brown and applied it as a glaze to the recesses to create a rich and interesting shadow on leather. And for the highlights I am using the mix of the original leather brown with some orangey brown. As always, I concentrated mainly on the edges, but also I added lots of dots and scratches to simulate the look of old leather. Finally, I added a bit of tan to the mix and put some selective extreme highlights on the edges of the leather surfaces. And to make the life easier, I used the same trick as on Armour, trying to paint with the side of the brush, holding it perpendicular to the edges. Looks quite nice, but painting all these precise edge highlights might be quite tedious. So let's switch to something simple. Let's paint the metallics. And here the process is quite straightforward. First of all, we need to establish a solid base color. Here I'm using gunmetal for the iron parts such as gun and backpack details. Left arm, decorative wings on the chest, some elements of the helm and this tiny computer on the right hand. Also don't forget about the numerous grenades on the marine. Next, I switched to the rusty gold and painted the rest of the details, which are quite limited. We have the insignia on the chest, on the left shoulder pad and on the gun casing. After that, we are ready to add some contrast to the metallics in the form of washes and glazes. But make sure the metallics are completely dried. I found out they can be reactivated with washes. So first of all, I decided to add some blue tint to the armor of the left arm using the dark blue contrast paint. I think it shows the arcane mastercrafted nature of the Deathwatch armor quite well and adds a tone of visual interest. But you can use whatever color you want. Speaking of which, for the rest of the steel and gold details, I'm using quite generic grey-brown wash, trying to push it in the recesses and avoid overflows. And after the washes are dried, I returned with the original colors, slightly dry brushing the edges to refine the shapes of the metal elements. Now let's get back to the regular acrylics, as we still have a couple of details left to do. For example, this little purity seals parchment on the left leg of our marine. And here I'm just reusing the dark grey-brown and warm grey that we used to highlight the armor. Just base coat the parchment with the darker one, then highlight edges and folds with the lighter. I really like how the brown tones work for the old paper, way more than the typical yellowish one. What's more, we are using the colors that are already on our palette. Finally, I decided to add some extreme highlights with a silver grey and simulate the text on the parchment by drawing tiny horizontal lines lens with a dark gray. If you want to add a bit of a variety to the text, you may also draw a couple of diagonal lines, which would represent capital letters. So, next we have this right shoulder pad. The Deathwatch Space Marines keep it in the colors of the original chapter, so there is no universal recipe here, and covering all the different shoulder parts from the set would take about an hour. So just find some good reference and use all the same principles as we used on the black armor, but with the chosen colors. This Space Marine is from the Salamander chapter, so the inner part of the shoulder pad should be black, in fact the same black as the armor. So it's already painted. The salamander symbol should be white, and I painted it using the same warm gray as on the parchment. Finally, the trim on the shoulder pad should be green, so I painted it using different dark greens, picking all the edges with the lighter ones. So yeah, I hope you get the idea and can repeat it with your chosen colors. And the last details we need to paint on our marines are the numerous lenses. So let's paint the pair of lenses on the helmet red. Here I used all the same colors as on the bolter casing. First, I covered the whole lens with a mix of dark red and black purple. Next, I drew the highlight with a dark red on the lower facing part of the lens. We need to leave about the half of the lens in the original dark color. Next, I switched to the carmine and draw an even smaller highlight covering about half of the previous dark red. Finally, I added a little bit of ivory to the carmine and draw a tiny line on the lower facing edge of the lens. Also, it's quite important to leave a dark line of original color which separates the lens from the helm. Finally, I put a tiny dot of pure ivory in the upper facing corner of the lens. It really helps us to sell the effect of reflective shiny material. And you can use the same techniques to paint the other lenses with any colors you want. For example, here I painted the rest of the lenses on the scanner and on the portable computer with the blue turquoise tones for some extra visual interest. And we are almost finished. The last thing left to do is to paint the base. All the marines from this kill team were put on the industrial bases, and as the miniatures themselves are quite dark, I will paint the bases in bright colors for more contrast. So, I think some rusty metal bases will look cool. I picked 3 different reddish orangey browns from darker to brighter. And first of all, I covered the base with the darker one. This time I'm using a stippling technique. I put some paint on the brush, wipe it on a paper towel a bit, and then start dabbing it on the base, creating a nice irregular pattern that leaves a bit of previous color underneath. This technique is really harsh on brushes, so use old ones instead of your nice and expensive Kalinsky brushes. Next, I switched to the brighter orange, but this time I stippled it more precisely, concentrating on the edges of individual metal plates and around the holes and rivets, leaving some previous layer untouched. Finally, I repeated the process with the lightest orange, this time reducing the area of application even more. And that's almost it. You can paint the base rim black and call it done. But I want to add a last small step, which level up our paint job and ties the miniature and the base together. I will use some brown pigments to create a layer of rust, flakes and dust on the base and feet of the Space Marine, because right now he looks a bit too clean and out of place in industrial environment. So I put a bit of pigment in a cup and mix it with some water to wash consistently. Then apply it with the old brush into all the recesses of the base and on the feet of the marine. Next we need to leave our miniature for about an hour. As the water evaporates, it will leave the pigment flakes in the recesses and as a light tint on the base and miniature. So now we can cover the model with the ultramatte varnish to seal the paint job. And our kill team is ready for the final reveal. And I'm really happy with the result. In my opinion, this kind of black armor looks better on the battlefield. And the techniques here are not too complex. I'm using just regular acrylics, and even usage of airbrush is quite limited. Speaking of which, are you okay with the usage of airbrush in the tutorial? I think this tool is quite common nowadays, and I really like to use it in the early painting stages to speed up the process a bit. But if you want, I will try to create a video with alternative tools such as sponges or just regular brushes. Write it down in the comments below. And there is lots more to come. But that's all for today. Thank you for watching and see you soon. Bye.